just after the war, to the mid-60s when mass immigration from India, Pakistan, there wasn't a Bangladesh then, but Bangladesh came to Britain. Our parents, what our parents did, what my generation and the generation just above me did in order to make the Britain where you can sit here now and have this kind of discussion. So that's the reason for being here. I'm very pleased to meet you all, and I hope in the discussion and the questions I can sort of give some insight. The other thing I will say is I was married to Howe, who is the standout civil rights activist of that era. And of course there's the Mangrove 9 film by Stephen Green shows who he was and what he did. So very radical kind of history I've got.
So obviously I do have a list of questions.
Oh, thank you so much.
I have a list of questions here for you, but I think, in my opinion, I'm sure a lot of the audience's opinion, I'd quite like to hear sort of your views on what we've spoken about today in the presentation, because you've obviously got personal experiences with elements of this, so if you want to share with us on that before we
So what I find about history is you need to be careful. If you're a real historian, you're going to look at history through the eyes of the people who participated in it. What's happening with a lot of history now is people are giving their opinions of history and saying that that's the history. So I would just be very wary that when you talk about with my history or our history, you can have an opinion on it, of course you can, but you need to look at it through the eyes of what we did and why we did it, because we had our reasons. You can then, back 20 years, 30 years on, look at the reasons and say, was it successful or was it not? But you can't deny what we did and how we did it. So the biggest contention I have is the slide on the Black Panthers, because it does not depict the working class, young people's movement that I belong to. So the Panthers was one organisation. I belong to an organisation called the Black Unity and Freedom Party, based in Peckham, West London. There was the Black Liberation Front, that was based in West London. There was in Nottingham, the Black People's Freedom Movement. In Birmingham, the Fasimbas and the Afro-Caribbean. So the Panthers was one of many Black Power organisations of the time, made up primarily of working class young people. It was not a middle class movement at all. So we had intellectuals and middle class people in it, like Althea Darkers, Farouk Dondi, but the mass membership and the people that drove that movement were young Black working class kids, of which I was one.
I read that you did an exhibition on British Black Power movements, is that right?
No, I haven't. No.
Oh.
No. So the biggest thing that we've done in terms of the era of that history is what you alluded to is the Steve McQueen documentaries.
Right.
So that's the biggest, that shows that era of history better than anything else. The BBC documentaries Uprising, and then the Small Axe series, which looked at the Mangrove 9, Black policing, the young man who went to prison after the uprising, and then wrote a book. They're the ones that, but I didn't do a Black Power exhibition, no. I have spoken at different exhibitions, but no, I did not.
Ah, okay. What ways do you think we can learn from protests of the past? Because obviously a lot of the presentation was on that, but in what ways do you personally think that we can learn from our past?
I think you have to have an understanding of the era of the history in which we lived. Because what you can't do is artificially connect movements when the circumstances for our protests are completely different. And the way in which we protested, I think, is completely different as well. We had no social media. We had the telephone and letters, and physically going around. So for the Black People's Day of Action, we physically went around and spoke to people to mobilise them. Now you don't need to do that because of social media. So I think the lessons are to understand the period of history in which we lived, but to also understand that we were successful. And why were we successful? And what did our era of protest mean to Britain? So not just to Black Britain, but to Britain. And the Black People's Day of Action is the watershed moment in Black British history, where things begin to change, where you see more Black people in civil society, you see more people going into education, teaching, into politics. I mean, when I grew up, we had 4 Black MPs. There's now 62 odd MPs from Black and different ethnic things. There's a complete sea change. So what I would say is don't make artificial comparisons, because you can't. Really kind of dig deeper into understanding the era, why we did what we did, and what change we were able to effect, because we did effect a lot of change.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, thank you. We've been talking about protest and the word protest, and a conversation we often have at Youth Forum is sort of how the media uses the word protest as opposed to riot, as opposed to uprising. Do you have any thoughts on sort of this choice of language and sort of, what do you think about this?
I think you've talked today, haven't you, about the portrayal of the media, the way we are, or protesters portrayed in the media, is very different from the way we view why we protest and what we do. So the important thing I think about the language is always to convey to the people who you want to influence what it is you're doing and why. Because we know, so Brixton's been called, it was the Brixton riots, wasn't it? We call it the uprising. Well, there's a difference. There's a difference between a riot, which is mindless and let's go and smash some things and let's, we're unhappy. And there's a difference between uprising. So the one thing about Brixton uprising, having lived on Merrill Road, which is parallel to the front line, and lived through that uprising in Brixton, is that it was organised. Although it began spontaneously, by the time the youth hit the street and worked out their tactics and strategy of how they were going to fight the police, it was organised. So that's why you wouldn't say it's a riot. So I think language is important, but you're not going to ever stop how the media portray you. I mean, after the Black People's Day of Action, where 20,000 of us marched, mostly peacefully, but because the police tried to block Blackfriars Bridge, which hadn't been crossed since the Chartist movement, that's why I knew about the Chartists. And we crossed the bridge on a working day on a Monday in London because we were not going to do the traditional protest of a weekend like today, going in, having your rally and then leaving. We said we wanted to disrupt London, so we marched through London on a working day. When we got there, the police tried to block us, and so the youth at the front fought the police to get through. And when they interviewed one of the organisers, Darkus, at the end of the day, they said, well, how did you find the day? And he said, I thought it was a very good day. And it was, because the parents had handed in petitions. And the front page of the Evening Standard had a policeman dripping with blood where the fighting had been. And it said, Darkus Howe said, this is a good day. You're never, ever going to stop the way the media portrays protest and demonstration, which they are doing right now with the Palestinian protest, we have to say, the way they're being portrayed. So in terms of the language, I don't think it matters once you're able to get the message of why you're protesting across.
Okay, that's really interesting, You spoke about the sort of changing historical context and how we can measure protest in that. Do you sort of, in your personal experience, think that protest is now becoming more effective and better, or do you think sort of this new context is making protest a more debatable matter? What do you think about?
I don't think you can look at things that way, sorry. No. I don't think you can say something better than what you did before, is it? It's different. Right. It's different. I mean, the Stop Oil protests and their militancy, the way they lie in the roads, we didn't do any of that. We, because of our history, we had come from the Caribbean, and the important thing about the Caribbean and that mass movement from the Caribbean is you have to understand that many of those people had fought for independence and believed that independence in those countries would give them a better life. So it wasn't just the promise of Britain, it was the fact that of the political failure of that class in the Caribbean to give them a better life. That's why people came in their thousands from India, from Pakistan, and from the Caribbean, is because they had thought in the independence movements of the 40s and 50s were going to make them have a better life in their own countries. And that was not realised. And that's why we came in our thousands here. It wasn't only the promise of what we were offered here, it was the fact that the promise of what we've been offered in our own countries was never realised. And that's why our parents came here and came in their thousands to work and do the menial jobs in British society that we've been invited to do and which were advertised in the Caribbean for us to come and do. So I don't think you can look at history in that way. Was it better or was it worse? You do what you can do in your own time and because of what you feel. And then historians can look back and say, this achieved this achieved that, this achieved the other. But I just think, again, you've got to be careful of artificial comparisons. You can't compare what's racism in Britain to the extent that you can't compare it with racism in America, because our colonial experience is different from the experience in America. We do not have that colonial experience. I think we just need to be careful. I always say to people, just be really serious about what you're doing and don't make these superficial comparisons. And that's why I can't really answer that question either, probably in the way that you want. But to me, I'm really pleased to see the Palestinian protests. I think like all of us, when we see, even now with Rafah, a refugee camp where people are living in tents and we see people are being bombed who are living in tents, you have to say we are now living in a society, in a world where basic human conditions are really being disregarded. I mean, we cannot stand by and watch this. So am I pleased? I mean, I asked one of my friends to come today, and he said I would, but I'm going on the Palestinian march. So I forgave him because I thought that was legitimate. So you know, we you know, so really pleased about what the Black Lives Matter I thought was huge. I probably, as an older person, my perception of Black Lives Matter probably isn't the perception of many people who are on it. For me, Black Lives Matter is the first time that hundreds and thousands of white people have joined our cause. When I was demonstrating, very few white people supported us. We were vilified, we were abused. The only people who supported us were kind of really left-wing organisations. Black Lives Matter movement to me is the first time hundreds and thousands of white people are saying this issue, this race issue is wrong, the way you are treating people because of race is wrong. So I have a much kind of longer view. That to me is the significance of Black Lives Matter, of the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the other things that have been done. So just try not to make superficial comparisons. It won't help you, it won't.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've spoken a lot about protest. Would it be okay if we spoke a bit about your career and sort of what inspired you to like take that route kind of thing?
Yeah. So I was born in Britain in 1948. My mother was a working class woman. My father was a seaman from Zanzibar, Tanzania. And when I was 9 years old, my father took me to live in Africa, in Tanzania. So I was brought up in Tanzania, in Zanzibar. And when we were traveling, my father sat me down and said, Leila, you have to understand one thing. Everything you've been told about Africa and Africans is wrong. I'm going to take you to Africa and you're going to meet people and understand African society. And of course, when I got to Africa and lived in Tanzania, and Zanzibar is where I lived, and had all of my secondary education in Zanzibar, I realised that everything I had been told about Africa and Africans was wrong in the British school system. And lived with, my father was a very devout Muslim, and so I lived with a quite wealthy Arab family because as a young woman it wasn't appropriate for me to live alone with my father, and so I went to live with the family. So I had lived in Africa, but I lived in Africa at a time when British colonial rule was coming to an end. So although the British left India in 48 and probably left Ghana in the 50s, Britain still ruled East Africa when I went to live in East Africa. So the school I went to was all white students. The language spoken in the school was English, even though in our lives we spoke Swahili. And so I knew what it was to live under a kind of colonial system. And that for me is probably an experience that I will not forget, because everything, you're living in Africa, but all your systems and all your governance is in fact white, European, or British. So I left Zanzibar just when I was 15 years old because there was a revolution in Zanzibar, and so my mother persuaded, although the British government said that I wasn't British, even though I was born here, and refused to help my mother bring me back to England because there was a danger that I could be killed. My mother managed to get me out of the country, and I came back to England in '64. And '64 is mass immigration now. I'm coming to an England that when I left didn't exist. We've got hundreds and thousands of people from the Caribbean and India and Pakistan, and of course Bangladesh as Pakistan later split. And the hostility and the racism was absolutely extreme. And so there I am, somebody who understands Africa. My father was a Pan-Africanist. I come back to England, to East London. My mother's a poor working class woman. She works in the sack factory. And all around me is the debate about these people should not be allowed to come into this country. Everywhere I went, it was these people should not be allowed to come to this country. Because of my colonial education, I went to a grammar school. So I went to Glasgow Grammar School. There were 3 black girls there, and our lives were made absolute hell. Even in a geography lesson, they would get up and say, Miss, my dad says these people shouldn't be allowed to come here. They've come to take our jobs. Miss, why are they here? And I'm in a class trying to learn geography, and all you're hearing is this. We were ostracized, no one would play with us, we were just vilified. So I went to my mum and I said, Mum, I can't stay in that school. And the teacher said to her, but she's got promise, you know, she's a bright girl, she could go on to university. And I said, Mum, I cannot stay there and hear this abuse. And so she said, well, Leila, in this society, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And we're poor working class people and we don't know anyone. So if you're not going to go to school, you've got to go to work. So I started my first job at 16 and I worked. But as I kind of at 16 going on, I would say to 18, 19, 20, because of my colonial education, I was reading. And the thing that saved me was books. I read Baldwin, I read Achebe, I read all the African writers. I did not stop reading. So although I wasn't having any formal education in school, I was educating myself really. And so when in England we're getting the first visits of Malcolm X, who comes over, we're getting the first black Martin Luther King comes over, I've, you know, because of my African consciousness and because I'm reading, I'm kind of already aware. So I kind of know, I've understood the world probably in a way which somebody I went to school with wouldn't understand, because I've got the colonial experience, I've got the African experience, I've got the working class white experience. So I'm kind of, I would say, although not formally educated, in my mind I was quite developed. And so after these visits and as I've talked about these young youth movements who were coming up, very much influenced by the Panthers in the United States, I joined one. I joined the Black Unity and Freedom Party, and we put out a paper called Black Voice. So the Black Panther movement's paper was called Freedom News. The Black Liberation Front's paper was called Grassroots. We're young people, many of whom had come over from the Caribbean at the ages of 8 and 9 years old. I was kind of rare because I was born here. Most of them had come as young people. But what we were determined with the influence of what was going on in the world was the way our parents were being treated. We were not going to be treated the same way. Absolutely not. We were not, when we saw what our parents had to suffer, had to endure, and that generation, you know, you cannot in any way underestimate, and always we must honour that generation who came here with nothing really but themselves and that history they've got in their heads, and were able to live in the most dire conditions in one rooms with 3 and 4 people with paraffin heaters, who are working side by side with white people who are earning more money than them, but persevere, and their dream is always to make a better future for their children. And it's when that realization that the better future for their children will not happen is what causes the militancy and the anger in my generation to say we are going to do something about this. So that's how really I got involved in black politics and black protests. I joined the Black Unity and Freedom Party. Although we were in all different organisations, I knew most of the Panthers. I knew Tony Suarez in Black Liberation Front. I knew Benny Bunsey, who was running the Fasimbas and the big Black Power organisation in Birmingham. We all kind of knew each other. We had our own network. We put our papers, we debated and we discussed. And we were young people and we were going for it. I mean, we were just determined. Yes.
Is your mum white?
Yeah.
So what was people's reaction when they saw like you with your dad's stuff?
So my mother and father divorced when I was quite young. My mother recalls being spat at in the street. My mother recalls that when I was born, they came with a dirty blanket to cover me, and my father had to go to the shops and buy clothes for me because as a black child, they put me in dirty clothes. My mother was vilified, and she was, I mean, her life was made hell because she had a black child and because she was with a black man. She says when she went home to her family, I mean, the story of my mum and dad is funny. It couldn't happen now, he'd be locked up. But my dad obviously fancied my mum, and she was working in a chemist shop as a young woman, and he kept going into the chemist shop to look at her. And she said, you know, she would see this man coming in. So I tell everybody now, my dad would be done for stalking now, wouldn't he? I mean, he'd be locked up. They would have arrested him. But in those days, he fancied her and kept going into the shop pretending to buy things so that he could have an interaction with her. And she says when she took him to my family, my white side of my family, they just said to her, Lily, what have you done? She said, absolutely. But my father was educated. He started the first halal butchers in East London and actually sold meat to Jews, to the Israeli embassies. So he was, he had his shop, so he was not, in that sense, the kind of typical immigrant. Had a butcher shop, he employed my auntie in his shop. And then they got to know him and so he was accepted. But her life was made her. No, my mother's early life. And that generation of kind of early white women who married black men, there's a whole story there to be told as well, which is overlooked. So no, not at all, not at all. So when I gave her a hard time and I went home with my big afro and told Mum I'm in Black Power, she said, all our partners for this woman, this girl, and now look at her. You know, I was in my long kind of African skirts, and I mean, my afro was huge. And I was telling, you know, Mum, I'm in Black Power now, and I could see her thinking, will it never end with this child of mine? So yeah, so very hard time, yeah. So yeah, so that's how I got involved in politics, and then met Darkers, who I married, Darkers Howe. We produced from Relton Road, from a squat. So Olive Morris helped us squat our first house. I always tell the story of Olive and us going down Mel Road, and she's saying, you can have this house, you can have this house, you can have this house. So we said, we'll take that house, broke the lock on the door, moved and squatted. And then we said, we need a place to bring our magazine out. So she said, oh, come down Shakespeare Road. So we walked down Shakespeare Road, and she said, you can't have that shop front, I'm not sure who owns that one. That one's owned by the council. So we said, oh, we'll squat that one then. Broke down that door, went in and squatted that one. And we produced a magazine for 14 years from the squat in Brixton, just right here. And there's 2 blue plaques there now, one for Darkers and one for CLR James. And so brought out a magazine for 14 years. But the kind of high point of my political life is the organisation of the Black People's Day of Action, which is the largest mass demonstration of Black people in Britain. I would say, for me, when I look back on people say, what's your achievements? I would say it was that mobilisation at that moment in history in 81 when, as I tell everybody, without social media or any kind of modern things, we were able to get 20,000 people to march for 8 hours through London to protest the murder of 13 young Black children in a racist house fire in New Cross. I would say that was my high point.
Thank you, yeah. Hannah,
can I ask a question? Just kind of, so I work at BCA, and
Yes.
having like the opportunity to look through some of these documents of your activist movements in the past, and like just, you know, the amount of administration. I just wanted to ask if you could talk about like what that process is like, putting something together as big as the Black People's Day of Action, kind of on a practical level. How do you manage to get such a massive, important historical moment to happen?
Sure. So I have to say, because and you will know this kind of as you go up, the political climate changes. So when we got the news of the house fire, it was telephone calls. Everybody was, have you heard, there's a party and it's been bombed out. That was what we were all told. And that was all done by telephone. And so we went down to the area, and because of I talked about these young Black movements that I was part of, on the night of the fire, we all just went and sat in the road. We stopped all the traffic. Nobody organised us to do that. So you would have got all the buses. You know, my friend Jean, who was in Black Unity and Freedom Party, she said she got on a bus and she knew that every young Black person on that bus was going to that house. Even without talking, they just knew where they were going. And they all got off at New Cross Road, and the house was then really burnt out. I mean, you can see from McQueen's documentary. And they just all sat in the road. They just sat there. Because for us, that was probably, after all the demonstration and protests we had done about racism and racist attacks, when the news, then it was 11 children had died between the ages of 13 and 18. 2 more later died in hospital from their wounds. But when the news got around that actually 13 young people had just died in this house fire, for us it was a moment of, no, this is too much. So we called a meeting in the area, in a Moonshot Youth Club, which had also had a fascist attack. And we thought, as political activists, we're going to get 100 people. And 400 people turned up. And the important thing was, 400 people had come from Luton, they'd come from Manchester, because the word had spread by telephone that these kids had been burnt in a fire through a racist attack. So we knew then that the moment was different, because we'd been protesting. By then, in 81, Race Day started in 73, I started my protest in 71. So I've been at it for 10 years. But we could sense, it's a bit like the Black Lives Matter movement, you knew the moment was different. And so we would meet every 2 weeks, every week. We called something called the People's Assembly, and anybody and everybody could come to that meeting and they could, you know, put their point of view. And by then there were kind of a lot of young men were really angry, and they were saying things like, time to pick up the gun, you know, we've got to stop this now, we cannot allow this to continue. And in one of the meetings, a black worker from Ford's got up and he says, we need to have a black strike. We're in all these industries, we're in the health service. The only way this government is going to take notice of us is if we call a black strike. And that turned into the Black People's Day of Action. So, and what we said is that we would not do what the left and everybody does. We will not march on a Saturday or Sunday when there's nobody around, go to Trafalgar Square or Hyde Park, have a rally and go home. What we would do is we would disrupt London, we would march through London, we would march from New Cross, from Fordham Park in Lewisham, and we would march through Hyde Park, and we were going to march through the city. And not since the Chartists in 1782 had anybody marched through the city on a working day. And I was on the delegation that used to meet with the police in Brixton Police Station, and they would say to us, you can march, you can meet in New Cross, you can march through South London, but you cannot cross Blackfriars Bridge. You cannot cross Blackfriars Bridge on a working day and walk through the city and disrupt it. And we said, no, but we want to. And they said, but you can't. But we knew they had people from the special branch, undercover agents in our meetings, and we knew that undercover agents were telling them the temperature's really hot in those meetings. You need to know there's some people in there who are really considered really militant action. So in the end they said, okay, we'll allow you to march over Blackfriars Bridge. But when the day happened and we got to Fordham Park and it was drizzling, and you've asked, sorry, about the mobilisation. So Dark as Howe went all over London, Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, and he spoke at community meetings. But because the feeling was so strong nationally now, no national newspaper covered the fact that 13 young people had died in the fire. The only paper that covered it was the South East London Mercury. So we've got no national press, but our own network and grapevines of telephone and meeting people and who we knew. So he went around the country nationally, spoke in community groups and schools. The headquarters for the Black People's New Cross Massacre Action Committee was raised today. So we coordinated all the requests that were coming in from schools and colleges. So the fire was in January, and we organised the thing. So we had 6 weeks really in which to mobilise, which we said would be a national demonstration. And that we did just by speaking, leafleting, campaigning. We had a guy called Alex Pascal on Black London. He did a lot of work on the fire. But the mainstream media completely ignored us. So we had to do it for ourselves. And that's what we did. So we did 6 weeks of intense campaigning and mobilising. I spoke at youth clubs, I spoke at universities, I spoke at colleges, because the news is filtering that now 13 young people have been killed in this fire. And for the Black community, it was the kind of, as I've said, it was a watershed moment. This was when we said, enough really is enough now. We have to do something. And so we did that for 6 weeks, mobilising, organising, speaking, producing leaflets, going around. We had one radio show, Black London, who said there's going to be this demonstration. And then we did it. And on the day, when we got to Fordham Park and it was drizzling, we thought, oh my God, it's raining, no one's going to come. And we're there. And I always say to myself, I remember thinking, oh, and people are looking and we've got that look like, have we been able to pull this off? And then the coaches just start coming from Leeds, from Liverpool, from Manchester, from Bristol, and Black people are just pouring off these coaches. And we kind of said, yeah. But as we're marching, the reason the march was so big, and McQueen film shows this, school kids are climbing over walls. They interview a young guy in college who said he was in his lesson, and they said, the march for New Cross is coming, and everybody just left the college and just joined the march. People on buses would look down, see what the march was for. We're carrying 13 coffins to represent the 13 people who've been killed. We've got placards of their big blown up placards of their faces, kids, young kids that we're holding up. We've got the Rastas are in the front with the Rasta flag, and Darkness is on the truck. We've got all these kind of symbols of our protest, and people are just joining us. People are shopping with their shopping bags, coming out and just coming into the march, and it's just growing and growing. So when we get to Blackfriars Bridge, remember we've agreed with the police we can cross it. They have a cordon across Blackfriars Bridge, which shows that we're not going to be able to cross. So I'm in the kind of mid-back of the march, and I kind of see the cordon, and I think, oh, that's all right, they're just there, but as we arrive, they're going to part, and that's true. And then as the march is getting closer, I realise that they're not going to park, they're not going to let us through. And the rastas at the front, the young people at the front, they just fought the police and broke through. I mean, that was the fight that then the media then had this bloody violent demonstration. But it was the youth at the front who broke through in order to let the demonstration proceed down Fleet Street, which is where all the newspapers were. As we're marching down Fleet Street, this is journalists, these are people who are writing, they're throwing banana skins at us, they're making monkey chants. And I say to everybody, if you want to know how Britain has changed, in 1981 when we marched down Fleet Street with journalists, people who have intellectual skills writing, who are making monkey chants and throwing banana skins at us from windows as we marched through, that was what we faced in 81. And for people who say not much has changed, I can tell you it really has, because that is really significant. And we march through, the parents go to 10 Downing Street to hand in a petition, we go to the House of Commons, the parents go again, we've got the parents linking arms marching in front of the march, and then we get through to Hyde Park. But it was 8 hours. But all of us have said, when we've kind of done interviews afterwards, is the 8 hours was like an hour, because the momentum and the power we felt on that day just carried us. It's only afterwards, when we were all thinking that, wow, our legs are aching, we're all in pain, that we realised we'd marched for 8 hours. So that for me is kind of, when I look at my life, I think that for me is the high point. And that is when you begin to see the shift in British society, politically and culturally. Because up until then, our generation and the generation before me, we did everything for ourselves. We formed our own black theatre co-op, we had our own music, we did everything for ourselves. We organised our own poetry readings. We had to, because mainstream society was not interested in black culture, it was not interested in black art, it wasn't. Not like now, where we've got Sonia Boyce, the British artist who's heralded as a huge international artist, Rubaina Hamid, all these top artists, they all began with us. We put on the first black art exhibition. We did it for ourselves. And that's why I speak, because I want people to know that's the history that nobody hears about. How our generation and that Windrush generation created the British society with all its flaws that you see today, and you see black achievement today, which was built by that generation, and that's what can't be overlooked.
Does anybody have maybe a final question?
Yeah, thanks, Leila, for this talk. What would you say is the one single most significant ingredient that starts that collaboration, that kind of framework of politicization, that the Day of Action, why didn't it continue? What broke it up?
So I think people call it corruption. Then you're seeing a lot of positions being offered to black people to enter mainstream society at the middle and senior levels of society. I think the kind of structure of the British black community has changed. I think then it was immigrant, now we've got a lot of West African immigrants, we've got a different composition. I think that social media has got a big part to play with it, but I think fundamentally, the ethos I grew up in was collectivism, that if you wanted to do something, you did it with others. Now we're in a society where the individual rules supreme. You have to make it, in order to show success, you make it on your own, you achieve financial success, you get cultural or music success. The individualism, I mean, particularly the way it's portrayed in the United States, I think that has really, a lot of our generations have now really bought into that the measure of success now isn't how you work with others to make change. The measure of success is how you do it by yourself and become somebody who's rich and famous. I think that's the big difference in kind of the ethos, and that's what society wants us to think anyway. It doesn't. It's all about, I made it, you know, I really tried hard. But the way society is structured, not everybody can make it. It's impossible. But we're all given this belief that if we work hard and if we do this, if we do that, we're all going to make it. No, we're not, because society relies on a structure where there's just a few at the top who can make it. And you know, people say to me, Jay-Z's a millionaire, Rihanna's a billionaire, and I say, yeah, but when they go to the G7, which they're going to do soon, there's not a single black face in those politicians who decide who will have water, who will eat, where the economics, where the riches of the world would go. That is run by 7 or 8 very powerful white men who meet in Davos in G7, who meet in these structures, and they determine how the world would run. So economic power doesn't equal political power. That's what I always say, and I think that's where it's got confused. The issue is now being an entrepreneur, get money, get rich, but it doesn't give you power to actually change people's lives. That power of how we live is run by very few people, and that's the reality of how we all live. Some people might say it's now the big social media, but no, it's Meta, it's that kind of whole introduction of technology, that people say they're the new countries, they're the people who are determining how we live. But the world has shifted, which is why I say, let's do these artificial comparisons. I didn't grow up in a period where you had Mark Zuckerberg and Meta. I didn't grow up in a thing where Jeff Bezos, where these really rich companies existed at all. I grew where there was countries, there were rulers of countries, we voted for politicians, and that's how it was done. That's not how the world is today. It's a completely different world, completely internationalized, globalized world, which my generation never had to face, and never had to face to protest either. So the protest is going to be different, really different.
When you were talking about reading as form of users, understanding history and present history, I read the earliest book that I read was A Black and Union Jack by Paul Gilroy.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, there was in that book there was in the 70s and 80s of like mixed clubs of like there was, correct me if I'm wrong, it was there could be black people and white people integrated together, mixing. Do you know anyone from your personal life that had positive experiences in that sort of environment? Because I read the book and there was some.
So the theory he's talking about is kind of the era of what the specials, and there was an era when it was called the Anti-Nazi League, the Anti-Racist League, and a lot of young white people got into reggae and into music. So we would kind of be socialising and interacting in those social clubs, because a lot of white people, young white working class people, I'd say primarily, began to adopt a lot of the symbols and signs of black culture, which still exists today, as we all know. But then, and so therefore there was much more kind of mixing. And even the kind of the generation I grew up with, and I say many of them were born in the West Indies and came here at 8, 9 and 10, but they went to school with a lot of white kids. There was a lot of kind of social interaction on estates and things, which again has kind of died down, not because of the kind of structure of societies changed as well, but no, certainly I had loads of white mates. We did have white mates, but we were quite clear in Black Power what we were about and what we were doing. And some white mates kind of understood it. Yeah, we know the way black people are being treated in Britain is wrong. We know it. And there's always been that movement. There's always been that white strand in society that says that this is wrong. The other thing, of course, in my generation, in Race Today, it was Asians, we had Farouk Mana, we had Indians in our organisation, as well as Africans, as well as West Indians. So our definition of black was also different to the definition of black today, where it's much more segmented, and that's also an answer to your question. That kind of unity you don't see now. It's become very compartmentalised and very individualised. But mainly it's this kind of individuals, we can all make it as these individuals in society that many of our young people have bought into, we have to say. And I would say to people, you don't have to be a big political activist in the way that some of us were, but everybody can make a change. All you need to do is get 3, 4 or 5 people who think like you, and you can do something. It doesn't have to be like you. You just need 4 or 5 people who talk to you, who you can get together and say, let's form a group and let's just put this out here and say, we want to debate about this, we want to debate about that. It's possible, it's possible. It doesn't have to be like big. In Black Unity and Freedom Party, there was probably 70 of us. I think the Panthers, they probably had 100 when they had their events at Oval House. They would get easily 100 youth coming to their meetings, easily coming to talks on African history, on colonialism. I mean, that was the era in which we grew. That's not the era now. It's a completely different, and I'm clear about that. People say to me, what would you do? And I say, I don't know, because all that's going on now, I would have to start from scratch. I know what I did and I know why I did it, but it's certainly, you couldn't do the same thing now. It's a completely different ballgame. Except the issues of oppression and inequality and racism still remain.
We do
In your experience, I know that we were just talking about like interactions with, say, white people or people who necessarily like aren't from that struggle. Did you have any experience with people, or especially white people, who changed their minds about their views? And if so, how did you go across with that?
So they joined us, so it wasn't a debate or discussion. We knew what we stood for, and either you agree with us or you didn't. So it wasn't like I'm going to persuade you that the struggle I'm in is important because it was that. We are doing this because oppression is wrong, we are fighting it and we're doing this. Do you agree or don't you agree? I mean, we were militant, we were strong in our beliefs, we were. Right now, I mean, there's much more of an ethos of dialogue and debate and persuasion, whereas when I grew up, we had to stand for something, you know, we had to stand up for our rights. Otherwise, we could see, I mean, there's a phrase now which is so old-fashioned, but it's called hewers of wood and drawers of water. If we hadn't made the stand that we did, the black population would not have what it has today, because definitely British society did not think that black immigrants, Asian immigrants, the way they viewed us, that we were worth very much at all. We were here to do the jobs. Even the middle class people who came here with degrees in education. My husband Douglas was a trained barrister, and when he went with his qualifications to the civil service, they told him he was lying. They told him it was not possible for a black person to have these qualifications. So he went to work in the post office. Many middle class people then had to do working class jobs because their qualifications were not believed. It wasn't believed it was possible if you were black that you would have these qualifications. So a lot of them had to do ordinary jobs, and then gradually, through their own determination and struggle, you know, were able to do it. But you know, our generation and the generation just before me, we had a determination that we had to make change, that change had to come. Otherwise, the lives of our children wouldn't be worth anything. And that's why the whole education movement was also so important. The Saturday schools and the supplementary school movement was because that promise of, even though I'm come here to do this job, my child will have a better life. When the realisation that that wasn't going to happen, that's why we then formed our own schools as well and had the supplementary school movement.
Any final questions?
So watch Steve McQueen's documentaries, they're still on iPlayer. They're really important, that period of history is really important to understand and remember, and to have an understanding of why we did what we did. And congratulations to all the young people who today still want to do something to make life better. Yes.
Did you meet Alex Weasel?
Yes, yeah, I met Alex, yeah. Yeah, definitely, yeah. Because he's the one who changed his life after he was sent to prison, after participating in the uprisings in Britain, yeah. Yeah, of course, yeah.
Well, Leila, thank you so much
Thank
for your time
you.
today.
No.
It's been so interesting to